So first of all, my name is Anna Sampson, and I'm the director of We Are Neutral. We're an environmental nonprofit here in Gainesville, and we offset the carbon footprint of Changeville. So we calculated the carbon footprint of all these venues that are hosting Changeville this weekend, and then we offset that footprint by planting trees, retrofitting low-income homes. So I'm really excited to have everybody here today, and I'm going to pass the microphone and have everybody introduce himself, and then we'll get started with the questions.
Hello, I'm James Muschler.
Hello, I'm Michael Wilbur from the band Hooch.
Hi, I'm Ryan Schleeter. I work with Greenpeace. I'm an online strategist and producer there.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Barnett. I'm a journalist and author who writes about water and climate change.
And you guys can kind of you don't have to go in order, whoever kind of wants to jump in with answers to these questions. Basically, I just kind of want more context of who you guys are, why you're up here, why they asked you to be up here, kind of your relationship with the environment, why you're passionate about it, some of the work that you do that brings you here today.
Well, as we all know, because we're all here, we face a critical time in humankind's history where the Earth is possibly near its 7th mass extinction of life. And as a human being and as a creature on this planet, I want to be a positive influence on the future of all the creatures on this planet.
Yeah, I would second that. Also, as a band, we're very avid animal rights advocates and promote veganism and that as a means to reduce our footprint and our destruction on this planet.
So before I worked at Greenpeace, I worked at a think tank called the World Resources Institute, which does a lot of really wonderful work. I worked in their Sustainable Cities program doing communications. And I spent a couple of years there, and I decided that as good as the work was and as good as the research that they were putting out was, that was not moving the needle fast enough on the issues that we were working on. It was not moving the needle fast enough on climate. It was not moving the needle fast enough on getting cities committed to renewable energy policies and setting more ambitious goals. And I thought that the reason for that is that we were talking to the wrong people. We were talking to people that we called influencers or decision makers or people given a certain kind of institutional power. And so I'm very excited to talk to you all today who have a different kind of power than institutional power. And it's, I think, something that we have to tap into because it is a stronger type of power than that institutional power. And we have the ability to move the needle faster on these issues. And so that's why I ultimately decided to leave the think tank world. I know there are researchers in the room, so I'm not going to poo-poo research right now. But I decided to leave the think tank and the research world. I'm not a researcher anyway. I do communications, so I didn't really need to be there. Somebody needed to be there doing communications, but it didn't need to be me. And move into the activism and advocacy world and work with people who wanted to do things to move that needle faster. And that's the type of work that I do with Greenpeace. So I say I'm an online strategist and producer. What that means is that I create content and I help create messaging and tactics that are going to try to move as many people as possible, try to mobilize as many people as possible, and try to build a movement, whether people want to align with Greenpeace or another environmental organization or another environmental cause, or follow their favorite band and see what tips for environmentalism they have. Whatever that means, we need more people, and we need people stepping up and escalating and taking action. And so that's why I'm excited to be here, like I said, talking to you all.
Yeah, I really love that comment and say amen. I feel really similarly. I was a traditional journalist and, covering a lot of water and environmental issues. And it started to strike me that water, one of the most important things in our lives, is the purview of a fairly small group of people who are making really important decisions. And I I began to see that really to change the way we live with water, to change the way we live with the environment, it really needs to be an ethical change among everyone and not managed anymore by a small group. So I think I have gone into full-time work on water and climate because I really see this as an issue for a group I think of as the caring middle. These are people who would care if they knew more about what was happening with water and with climate. And that's sort of the group I write for when I write, and that's a group I talk to the students about engaging with when I teach. And when you think about big changes we've made in the past on the environment, you could think about littering or catch and release fishing or the big environmental regulatory changes that we made in the early 70s. It was all a result of the general public finally coming around to something, right? When we stopped damming the rivers of the American West, or when we finally started regulating industrial pollution so that the rivers of the Northeast would no longer catch flame. That was really because the majority of Americans got fed up and said, this is not okay anymore. And we very much need now the majority of Americans to say this is not okay. And so I think that's why I'm in this too, to help more people see that this is not okay.
If I can add just one specific thing to what you just said, that problem of like the rivers of the Northeast lighting on fire, it's those very regulations that are under threat, like in this exact moment that we're speaking. So it never was a theoretical exercise, but I think as communicators we could have done a better job of explaining that from the beginning. But now we're in a moment where it is like so far not a theoretical exercise, like a law called the Waters of the U.S. law and the Stream Protection Rule, like these very basic things. Like nobody voted for coal dust in their water. That wasn't a platform that anyone ran on and voted for. But that's the kind of thing that we're seeing right now.
I want you all to say kind of like that moment that you realize like this is your cause. Like we have like a limited energy, right? And we can only focus on so much, or only so many hours in a day, and we only live for 100 years, right? So like what was the moment where like this is my cause, like this is what I'm fighting for, this is my passion, and this is what I'm going to spend a lot of my time to try to support?
When I was growing up, I felt really connected to nature and had a lot of love for the natural world. And as I grew older, I realized that there is this kind of mental separation that human beings have between ourselves and our environment. And a few years ago, I heavily pondered, where do I fit in? How can I help to change this? Because it's the root of the problem that we're facing. And I'd say the biggest way that I've been able to make some effort, however small it may be, is to adopt a vegan lifestyle. I learned that cows, in particular, are the #1 contributor of methane and nitrous oxide and carbon emissions into the atmosphere by a long shot. And not only that, they're the #1 cause for deforestation and the destruction of the Amazon. And these things aren't really talked about. So by adapting a vegan lifestyle, I'm reducing my carbon footprint by tenfold. It takes 25 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of eggplants, and it takes 2,600 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. And, that's just one example. For sure. And, there's a lot of things you could do, but, the meals that we eat every day is one simple way of just cutting down significantly. if you can just avoid eating meat, you're essentially doing the equivalent of driving 10,000 less miles in a day, assuming you eat one cow every year. Maybe you do. But one cow is essentially the same contribution as carbon contribution as driving 10,000 miles.
Yeah, I second all that. I got into this about 6 years ago. I mean, I've always been a nature freak, and as a part of nature, essentially, obviously, I've always really connected to it. And as a musician, early on, I always listened to the birds and the sounds of nature as part of this greater orchestra of music, this cosmic orchestra, and I was really connected with that. And then I started putting the pieces together as I grew older and got out of my parents' house and out of their ideologies. I started seeing this human supremacism that we're all been indoctrinated with, and this anthropocentric kind of mindset. And it started to really disgust me. And then I learned about the factory farming and the billions of animals every year that we needlessly rape, murder, and torture just for our taste buds. And then I learned about how damaging that actually is to the planet, and how, like James said, all the research I've done has led to that being the leading cause of almost every disastrous, environmental trouble that we face. And then I saw this documentary, Cowspiracy. You guys familiar with that? Yeah. And I also found it interesting that people don't really talk about it, and I think it goes beyond a personal, fear of giving up the addiction to eating meat, but it's also a very strong corporate stranglehold that these massive corporations have. They have mercenaries behind these companies that go after people that really speak out against what they're really doing. And just learning about all that made me feel like I have to do at least something. I have to at least talk about it to my fans. I have to at least pass out pamphlets at shows, and obviously my main thing is music. I don't spend all my time doing research. This isn't my main thing, but I do what I can, and I'm happy to be here.
So I'm gonna flip this question on its head a little bit. You're gonna find this out about me throughout the course of the panel. I'm a little subversive like that. But I never decided, and I hope I never decide, that this specific thing is my cause. Because I don't think it's productive to think of it that way, because it's so deeply connected to what we might define as other causes or other. And then once we define them as other causes, they become other people's causes, and they become not my responsibility. But just as it's our responsibility to confront factory farming and everything that you guys just talked about, it's also my responsibility to confront white supremacy and patriarchy. And I shouldn't separate that from the work that I'm doing, because they are connected. And when we talk about all of the things, all of the sort of topics that fit within like the standard definition of environmentalism, whether it's access to clean water, your right to have your environmental health, and the pollution in your neighborhood, the impacts of climate change, they all disproportionately affect marginalized communities. So we can't actually separate this from the other causes or issues that we've been talking about at Frank and at Changeville. And I don't think we should. For a long time, the organizations that I work for and that I work with, and the movements that we were part of did that. They found it helpful to narrow down and focus and sort of stay in their lane. And that's partly, I think, what led us to many of the challenges that we have today, because our opposition does not do that. Our opposition works together very effectively to attack progress on all of these fronts at the same time. So you think of something like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which, if you're not familiar, is basically like a factory mill for writing like conservative legislation. Lobbyists get together, they write a bill, someone in Congress introduces pretty much that exact legislation Corporations fund 99% of ALEC, or 98, one of those. They fund almost all of it. So they're basically working on behalf of our opposition, and they're working in concert, and that's just one example. They're working together, and they're very effective. And so when we work together, we can be that effective, and we have to be if we're going to overcome that. So whether or not you're like emotionally or just intuitively more drawn to particular issues, that's great, and we cannot do it all at the same time in our individual lives. But I think it's helpful for us to think about being called to a cause and then recognizing the way that that's connected to everything else that we care about. And if I were to end in the most trite way possible, I would quote the quote, "We do not live single issue lives," and I think that's very true, and something that we have to sort of come to terms with in our work even more.
I really relate to that statement, and my experience is similar. So you asked sort of what that moment was when we decided to devote ourselves to this life, and mine wasn't so much the environment as the justice of the thing. So when I was a kid, I was close to nature, but I also, in my childhood, had this really intense sense of justice and injustice, and I think that's part of what drove me to become a journalist. And then once I was a journalist, when I would sit there watching, someone get a permit to fill in a wetland or get a consumptive use permit when the aquifer was already depleted or whatever it was, these things that happen all the time, I would think to myself, that child in me would say, why do they get to decide? And that sense of justice, more so than the environment per se, led me to this. And I think, what really strikes me about Ibram Kendi's work, you guys heard him today at Frank, and he was sort of answering the question, why is it that if we've made so much racial progress, we haven't made more racial progress? Why is there also racist progress at the same time? And he showed how powerful people who benefit from racism were just as effective or more so than people working on, integration and all of those other things. It's the exact same story with the environment. If you look back and say, why... Okay, yes, the rivers are no longer catching fire, but why are the coastal estuaries on the southern Florida coast so much worse off now than they were a couple of decades ago? Why are we seeing more harmful algal blooms all over the world than we were a couple of decades ago? There's a reason behind this, and it's because the polluters have made just as much progress as the environmentalists have. And so these are all really deeply and profoundly connected.
My next question is, I know I've experienced people say it's too much. It just seems impossible. So how do you fight being discouraged, or how is that discouraging thought empowering of sorts? And so, it's a big task, or whatever it is that you're wanting to do. How do you not get bogged down with the big picture, or how does that kind of fire you up?
Nothing is for certain, maybe we will all die. We're definitely going to die individually. Humans, maybe something terrible will happen in the next 100 years and we'll have to rebuild in accordance with the natural laws of our home planet. But if there's anything I have faith in, that maybe there's something that could have gargantuan influence. Sometimes I fantasize about nanotechnology being able to be used in resourceful ways where, 10 years from now, maybe, a microchip will be the cost of, a piece of a little scrap paper or something. And then it becomes economically feasible to put nanotechnology in the water supply to break down toxins into just organic molecules that are non-toxic. Perhaps nanotechnology that you could put in the soil that could break down toxins from factory farming. Maybe you could put nanotechnology in the atmosphere that breaks down greenhouse gases into possibly their atomic structure. And we can already do this in the laboratory, so maybe if it becomes economically feasible, that's something that could have a big impact. Another thing that inspires me is mycelium. Paul Stamets has done a lot of work working with mushrooms, and mushrooms have this amazing ability to not only filter out toxins through their mycelial network, but also convert those toxins into more simple atomic structures that are non-toxic. Essentially doing the same thing that nanobots are doing in laboratories right now. Besides that, I think just being nice to people and at least thinking about the environment, thinking about your place in the world and how you fit in, and encouraging others to do the same, I think is all we can do on a day-to-day basis.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So I guess a good example is, sometimes like I have a friend, it's just too big of a problem, and you just watch these documentaries and it just seems too big. And so, how do you use that either to inspire you, or if it does just frustrate you or overwhelm you, what is your experience with that?
What really rung a bell with me was the justice thing you were saying. I feel a very deep connection to the planet because it's something that has given my whole life without asking for anything back. And to me, that's unconditional love. And also, I relate that to something my mother gave me and my family. And I think about what I would do if someone were raping, murdering, attacking my mother. And I wouldn't just stand by and do nothing. Obviously this is a different issue, and that's a very direct thing that I could act on in that moment if that were happening. But I just feel like I have to. I can't not think about it, and I can't not feel the pain that we're inflicting on the planet. So I just, I have to do. I'm not saying I've figured out exactly necessarily what it is that is the best action for me to do through my platform yet, but I do have the feeling that I need to act, and being here and meeting you folks makes me feel like there's, more. I hate to use the word hope, but that.
Yeah, well, and from my side, it's also exciting to see people who are not career organizers or nonprofit workers who care about this enough to come up and sit on a panel. So it goes both ways. People often like to ascribe the energy and enthusiasm of a movement to a place like Greenpeace. And I thank you, but I think that's totally undue because it has to come from all of us. And I feel like there's sort of two parts to this question, right? There's the sort of personal struggle, the personal dynamic of doing work that is challenging, confronting issues that are hard and visceral, and we're up against a lot. There's how that feels personally, and as someone who reads internet comments as part of my job, I very much understand that becomes difficult. So self-care is just as radical an act as chaining yourself to an oil train so that it can't leave, especially in the type of work that we're doing. You have to take care of yourself, whatever that means for you, and create space for that. And if your profession has you routinely doing work that is difficult mentally and emotionally, and they're not making that space for you, have to advocate for that. And if that comes through more in your personal life than in your professional life, then just remember that you have to make space for that. And I think the other dynamic of that is not the personal, it's the systemic. So we're up against these vast systems, these systems of justice and injustice and power that feel very abstract and are much bigger than us as individuals. And yet, I think what comes down sometimes is the message that it's our individual choices that are what are supposed to confront these vast systems. And there's a lot of guilt attached to that. I think particularly in the environmental movement, maybe more so than in other parts of the progressive movement. And I think we have to absolutely do away with that. We have to absolutely do away with that type of stigma, because not everybody has the same choices available to them, and not everybody has the same agency within their own life to make that type of choice. And if we put the emphasis and we put the onus on individuals to make that choice, we take all the blame and all the focus away from the people who are limiting the choices we have in the first place. So getting back to the question of justice and why do they get to make the decision, if we're over here talking about well, you could have bought a hybrid car and you didn't, we're not talking about why do they get to make the decision anymore. And I do think that's the type of question we need to be asking, the type of system we need to look at. So taking things into your own life it can be very empowering. It can be a great way to start conversations and make connections. But I don't think it can be the end. And for me, that is very comforting to know that if I mess up and I don't live my values for a day, it's not the end of the world, because we're looking at these huge systems and we're in it for the long haul. That can be a little bit comforting. Fossil fuel executives are not holding themselves to that standard, and it's beneficial for them when we hold ourselves to standards that we cannot meet, because it means that we're not working against them, and we need to be working against them.
So the way I answer this question for myself and the way I find is helpful for my audiences is that I am really interested in environmental history. So in all three of my books about water, I write a lot about the history of the earth. And in fact, in my latest book, which is a cultural and natural history of rain, I begin with the rains that filled the oceans 4 billion years ago. So I went way back in history. But I find history comforting in a lot of ways. For example, I wrote about the mega drought of 4,000 years ago that sent people wandering again. It collapsed the early civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia and so on, and people, start wandering again in search of water. So at all of these times in human history, we've screwed up, or something dramatic has happened. We lose a lot of people, and we kind of get our act together again and come together. This is true in modern environmental crises too. So one other interesting period of history is during the early Industrial Revolution. You may know that the skies over London were just absolutely black. It was a horrible time. People were dying of these lung diseases. There would be these terrible fogs when people couldn't even see to go out during the day, and they would have to wear masks. That culture went through that crisis and ended up cleaning the air. The same happened in Los Angeles early in the 20th century. The skies over Los Angeles are black. We dealt with air pollution. There have been really horrible ideas throughout our environmental history. There was a plan in the United States to dam the Grand Canyon, along with some of the other horrible dams that we did do. Americans essentially decided that it was not okay to dam the Grand Canyon, and we didn't do it. You can look at can look at extinction of species. The American eagle was absolutely on the brink. Mid-20th century, and especially here in Florida, the numbers had absolutely plummeted, and the American eagle is a really beautiful story of species coming back strong, in part because of strong environmental regulations. So that's my answer. That's where I get my personal inspiration. I'm very interested in history, and not just what we did, but how the earth has renewed too, with us and without us.
I want to ask too, this is inspiring, right? I love that I'm here. I feel like I'm just attending this. And I think you all are going to think about this for the rest of the day, right? So like, how do you keep that conversation going? You know, how do you keep that, you know, in my downtime, I just watch documentaries, or, you know, I just like to keep that fire in me and that passion and just in talking with people like similar to this. And you know, you're handing out flyers, and I know that you're writing these articles. And so, but for everybody else, how do we together keep this as a conversation? So how do we make this the topic that are on people's minds? Like, that's a part of what our nonprofit tries to do, is just to make you think about it more. So how do you do that, or how do you think we should do that as a community, you know, and outside of what you guys already do in your daily lives?
I mean, as far as interpersonal relationships go, you know, people you meet, people you talk to, just talking about it can make a huge impact on their life. I think a much more effective and global thing to do would be to somehow bring this to the attention of the mass media, because the stories that they cover are very, 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 very seldom having anything to do with the state of the world as an ecosystem. How do you do that? I don't know.
We're in an interesting position because we're a band, and we have about 60,000 people following us on Facebook. So we make a post, and it immediately starts a dialogue. Our posts can be very polarizing for a lot of the places we travel and a lot of the people that would come to see us. But for us, it's as simple as just here's an article we thought was interesting. What do you think? And we post it, and then a discussion happens. And you know, that's just one way that we do it. We spend a lot. It's funny because in all of this, you know, we're still part of the system that is essentially killing us. You know, we drive in a van and we tour the country. And while we're vegan, we're still part of the problem in that way. And it's really difficult, but you know, things like this, I think, are accomplishing what you were talking about and keeping the dialogue open.
Yeah, so I'm gonna actually steal a line from one of my favorite Frank talks that happened from Chanel from the BLM network, which is, my answer for this is be radical from wherever you sit. I loved that line. I told her 1,000,000 times. She said, please stop following me and telling me how much you love my speech. But I thought that was the perfect answer, especially for, in an environmental context, because like I kind of alluded to earlier, the environmental movement and environmental organizations in particular, like the actual like nonprofit industrial complex element of it, have been very prescriptive for a long time. For a long time it was, if you care about the environment, you will recycle, or you will not buy from this company that has done X. And it told you very specifically what you had to do to meet the terms of somebody who, like, in our estimation, gave a crap. And that's really not the way to create change at the scale we need. That's not the way to break down the systems that have limited our choices. So, you know, you mentioned like we drive around in a van, and you would probably prefer to do that in another way. But what other way is there? And it's not your individual responsibility to figure out what other way that is. We hear those types of stories because they are exceptions. And if we want change at the scale we need those choices available to us so that it does not become exceptional to make that type of choice. It needs to be more accessible. And so by being radical from wherever you sit, I like that because it's a guideline, it's a framework. It's not a prescriptive, specific action that is relevant right now and in 3 months won't mean anything to you. And I think what it means, if I'm extrapolating based on what Chanel said, this might be wrong based on her talk, but for me, what that means is whatever you have access to, whatever privilege you hold, whatever space you have, whatever platform you have, and I think you guys are a great example of this, try to use it, try to push it as far as you can. And when you're not sure if what you're doing is right, like lean in and try to figure it out. Listen to people when you talk to them. Listen to their response. Don't be afraid to bring up difficult topics. Don't be afraid to be labeled as a troublemaker. I think we need to start becoming more uncomfortable with the idea of people thinking we're okay with something unjust that's happening than uncomfortable with being labeled a troublemaker in our spaces. And you can ask my uncles that I yelled at Thanksgiving what that looks like in my own life. So it's this idea that I think we shy away from difficult topics because it's hard to bring up. Maybe we shy away from having that conversation with a colleague that made like a semi-racist remark, or having that conversation with somebody who maybe questions the science of climate change. We shy away from that because it's easy to feel like we're going to be labeled and we are going to be ostracized. When in reality, I'm much more uncomfortable with the idea that those people get to walk away and go continue doing that than I am with the potential that they will label me and ostracize me. And that's another thing that I think can be very motivating. So to be radical from where you sit, talk to people, listen to them, push a little bit more. I think we need to be comfortable escalating right now. And I think a lot of people are. In the wake of the election, people have stepped up in new and different ways. So I work a lot in sort of online to offline mobilization with Greenpeace. And we've always had a very large online base, and many of them also will do things, they'll sign a petition, and then we'll follow up, and they'll show up at the march, or whatever that ladder looks like for that particular moment. Since the election, we've seen willingness to step up and do big things increase exponentially. But those big things, the Women's March, probably the biggest example, in a sense, became a little bit sanitized because people wanted to do the big thing, but they still wanted it to feel safe. And we didn't push the boundary as much as I think we could have. There was a moment at the Women's March where I was in DC. We actually occupied like the whole route. The whole permitted route was filled with people. So if we moved, we were off route and we didn't have the permit. And they said, okay, well, I guess it's just we stand here and then we go home. And I was like, no, we have enough people to take the city. We can, when else are we going to have this opportunity? And what are you going to do when 500,000 people just start marching? And are you going to say you don't have a permit? No. So that's the kind of thing that we need to start thinking about and becoming a little bit more comfortable with is when you don't have a permit, what's going to happen if you do it anyway? And I think what will happen is systems change that we need.
So I'll talk about a couple of places to continue the conversation. One place that I never in a million years imagined myself being as a journalist would be in a church pulpit. And I have found myself in many church pulpits over about the past 10 years. About 10 years ago when my first book came out, this nun called me and asked me to come speak at the Diocese of Venice in Southwest Florida, which is an enormous diocese, and I was so intimidated, I thought I would surely be struck by lightning for getting up there and trying to hawk my ideas. And it really, it was just so powerful to see the appreciation for water issues, environmental issues. A lot of churches for a long time have gone out into the developing world and helped dig wells and helped do all of these things as an obligation to the poor. And I find that conversation is very easy to take to the next step, to go in and talk about climate change, for example, is an absolute obligation to the poor. As we've heard, the poor will be far more impacted by the impacts of climate change, both around the world and here in our country. You know, the 1% will be able to adapt and to flee and do whatever they need to do. Did anyone read the piece in New Yorker about the Silicon Valley tech people who are prepared for Armageddon? They've got helicopters and guns, and they're completely ready to flee when something happens. Instead of spending the money to help communities adapt, they're sort of ready to take off in their helicopters, which really bothers me. So anyway, I would say churches are one place that may sound a little surprising that really can make a difference in communities and can be a place that welcomes us to come talk about climate change, water, and other environmental issues. The schools is another place I spend a lot of time with the next generation because teachers here in Florida and around the country, sometimes it's actually hard for them to talk about climate change in the public schools, even though they are science teachers. And so they often really appreciate help to be able to come in and talk and do projects with kids. And then the last sort of place in the community that I'd like to mention, and maybe it's not a place, but it's more of an issue. I really think there is this downfall between environment and race. And though, you know, groups who are working on race issues and environmental issues too often having wedges driven between them by people who are actually working against both racial progress and environmental progress. That has happened in our community, and it's happening nationally with some of these, you know, quote, jobs issues. And I think that's really, I think it's really dangerous, and I think such an important thing to happen would be that people who care about both of these issues come together and bring this to the community as a whole and show the ways these issues are profoundly connected. So that would be another place I would say it would be great to continue the conversation.
We probably have time for like one more question, and I want it to be something that you guys can leave with. So my employee Danielle and I, we talk about all the time, like the little things, you know, like I don't know if you guys have heard the starfish story where there's all the starfish washed up on the shore and they're dying, and there's a guy that is just throwing them back one by one, and the other person says, "What on earth are you doing? You'll never even make a difference. There's millions of them." He's like, "But I made a difference for this one right now, and then this one." And so like Danielle and I try really hard to adopt these little tiny things in our daily lives and celebrate them big. Like if I ride my bike and I really wanted to drive, you know, just to really honor that. So 2 parts is how do you adopt those in your lives, and how do you, other than like, I guess, leading by example, how do you inspire others to adopt those tiny things? And I hope you all do some tiny thing today that's good for the earth. So how do you adopt those tiny lifestyle changes, and how do you inspire others to do that as well?
Yeah, like you said, public transportation, riding bikes is very good. Anything that doesn't burn fossil fuels. Like I said earlier, eating vegan is a very big step. If you're someone that eats meat 3 times a day, if you just replace that with something else, and it could be anything from nature's plethora of abundance, you're saving probably hundreds of gallons of water per day, not to mention all the grain that was used to feed the animal that you would have been eating. And you'll be contributing to a much more sustainable agriculture and not supporting a very destructive one.
Every time. Can you repeat the question again?
So basically, what are some tiny things that you do in your life,
Okay,
you know, that make big
Yes.
change, and how do you inspire others
Gotcha.
to do that?
Sorry, I'm like a fish. So we play shows almost every night, and our shows are kind of insane, like very high. If you have the chance to come tonight, you'll see. It's a very high energy, almost shamanic kind of thing. It's like we all just kind of lose our minds, and it's 2 hours nonstop, high intensity dance music. And afterwards, people always come up to me and they're like, "How the hell do you do that?" And when the band started, I was smoking cigarettes. I was eating meat 3 times a day. I was like, I didn't care about anything. I was basically a nihilist without knowing it. And yeah, for me, changing my diet was so huge, and it's still, I can't put enough emphasis. And the people that I've somehow managed to convince to try being vegan have also seen a huge change. So I mean, that. When people ask me where do you get your energy from, you know, I say my diet and how I eat and how I also my habits. You know, I exercising, and I feel like just taking one little step like that opens your eyes to a whole another you know, plethora of things that you weren't previously thinking about. You know, my doorway into this whole thing was animal agriculture and how first off meat affects your body, and also how it affects the planet. So I don't know, just, you know, telling people about that and trying to spread that is one thing I do.
So remember how I said that the environmental movement has a tendency to be really prescriptive, and I think we should stop doing that? I'm going to break my own advice and give you a few things that I think would be helpful if we all did a little bit more. But my earlier advice stands as well. So just, we contain multitudes. Keep that in your mind. So I think I like the way that you phrased this when you said, like, we celebrate the little things we do, and they're little, but we celebrate them big. And I don't think we do enough of that in the environmental movement or in any progressive movement. We do not celebrate our wins enough. We do amazing things, and then we sit down and we say, okay, let's debrief and analyze and figure out what went wrong so we can do that part better. And we skip the part where we say, like, hey, that was pretty cool. And that makes it very difficult to work in this field and with any kind of longevity. So I think we need to start. I think we need to start celebrating big, even when the win is little. We need to start celebrating that more, and we need to start building that energy, and we need to start making this work cool and fun, because it is. But we can sometimes get bogged down in how serious and how difficult it can be. And we know that we're not going to win over the sort of cultural middle, or people who are not moved by the type of, like, emotional story or fact that we give them, that might be moved by a more cultural message, or something that it doesn't come from people like me. It comes from people like them, for instance. We need to start making that possible again, and I think this idea of celebrating big, even when the win is little, is something that can do that. So celebrate your wins. Celebrate what you do. Don't beat yourself up when you don't win or when you don't do it. So if you had made that decision to drive, don't beat yourself up, and remember that it's ExxonMobil's fault that you have to drive in the first place. And then channel that frustration, that it's ExxonMobil's fault that we have sprawl, and it's ExxonMobil's fault that we still rely on gas and fossil fuels, or, you know, all of them. It's not just Exxon. And I'm being, like, minorly sarcastic. It's not obviously their fault. But they're creating a system that we all live in, that we all operate in. People love to call out any kind of hypocrisy they see from the left. So Greenpeace in 2015 was working to stop Shell oil from drilling in the Arctic. And one thing that we did a lot, they were very active in the Pacific Northwest. They were using the ports of Portland and Seattle for their drilling rigs and their ships. Before they went up to Alaska. And so we did a lot of kayaktivist blockades. A kayaktivist is an activist in a kayak. Preferably a brightly colored kayak, because it makes a beautiful photo. that was on the cover of the New York Times that made me really excited. Anyway, so we would put people in kayaks to block the ships, or we would dangle them from a bridge. I think people are more familiar with that one. Ultimately, that was more successful at stopping the rig, but I digress. We would put people in kayaks to stop them, and the very first thing that people would tell us is, did you know that kayak was made from petroleum? And the answer is yes, we do know that, actually. And we also, while you're at it, we did drive there in a car, and we will drive home in a car, because we all live in this system. And we will not defeat it by limiting ourselves to working outside the system all the time. The system is too big and too strong and too powerful and too well-financed for us to do that at this point. So when there are moments when you cannot do that, just do not beat yourself up about that. It's not personal. And maybe that's another little thing that you can take with you. That's actually not very little. That's pretty big. I'm not good at thinking small. I've been trying to think big this whole time here at Frank. Lots of big ideas, big, inspiring, ambitious ideas. But I like the idea of trying to eat less meat, or no meat. So I'll second that.
I'm just going to go with something completely different and maybe even gross, because you asked for something small, and I've been thinking a lot about sewage lately. And the reason I've been thinking a lot about sewage is that one of the impacts of the extreme rains that we're seeing, rains are becoming more extreme in a warming planet, and coastal areas such as St. Pete, where I just had an event the other night, on these hard rains, the first emergency that's happening, it's not sea level rise, it is the rise of sewage from manholes all over the city. There's like 800 manhole covers in the city. They're popping out sewage on these hard rains. Sewage flows in the streets. This is already happening in St. Pete. It's already happening in Miami. And, sewage traditionally, it's been one of the main polluters in our drinking water. So a couple of things. I've learned a lot about sewage. And we actually learned a lot about sewage on Blue Ether, right? When Stacy went to the wastewater treatment plant and found out all the challenges they have. So there's a couple of things about sewage that I've learned that are really important that you don't really think about a lot. For one, if you have a dog, this seems really obvious, but I know people don't do it. If you have a dog, you really should pick up the dog poop when you walk the dog. Even in a city like this that doesn't have an ordinance, it's not to be a good neighbor. It's because if you don't pick up the dog poop and then it rains next time, it's going to go right into the stream and then into your drinking water supply. Likewise, if you flush things you shouldn't flush, then it really messes up the wastewater plant, and next time the extreme rain comes, it'll be more likely to send sewage up out of the manhole covers. So don't flush your tampons, and don't flush the wipes that say flushable, because they're really not. So I just thought I would add something a little enticing for all of you.
Gosh, well, on that note, that's pretty awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. This is awesome, really inspiring. Everybody go see Moon Hooch tonight at Lucy's. And yeah, just try to make a small change today and be inspired and continue the conversation. And enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you. Yeah.